This is Inside Itinerary. I am your host, Seth Kaplan. Thanks so much for joining us once again. A lot to talk about, as always, this week. And I want to start off with a pretty big story about an airline that might be bigger than you think it is, depending on how much a part of your life it is. I'm talking about Spirit Airlines, which has once again filed for bankruptcy, a second bankruptcy filing at Spirit Airlines, following one less than a year ago. This is unusual. A first bankruptcy filing for airlines historically is sadly maybe not as unusual as they would hope for it to be. This is a tough industry full of booms and busts, and airlines face all kinds of headwinds, everything from economic issues to, God forbid, terrorism that's happened in the past. All these things affect airlines. But they end up in bankruptcy. They restructure. That's the point of bankruptcy for any company. And Spirit Airlines, on the other hand, has filed a second time, as I said, in less than a year. So basically what happened was they tried to restructure the company the first time, and they've basically come out and said that that wasn't successful enough, that here they are again facing a crunch here, filing a second time, planning to reorganize a second time. All kinds of questions about this, and I'm going to actually leave them for the second part of this show. We're going to keep the first part today real quick, real short, because I've got a guest who's going to help us walk through all of this. What does it mean for me, if I'm a passenger on Spirit Airlines? That part I'll tell you really quickly about. The airline's flying right now, so don't worry in terms of flights that you have booked in the immediate future. But as far as the longer term questions, we are going to get to that in the second part of the show. Staying in the airline industry, and this is going to be an airline heavy show, I'll tell you right now. We do it all, right? We do the planes, trains, automobiles. We've focused in the past on Amtrak or on car trip trends. Today, just a lot of airline news. So you go all the way back to 9/11, which was, of course, a defining moment when it came to airline security, because terrorists managed to get into cockpits of airplanes, and we all know what happened next. And airlines reinforced the cockpit doors, made it more difficult for somebody to come in. Now there's a code, and it's not something where somebody could just easily penetrate the cockpit door. But for all these years, 24 years now, there's been this clunky part of that whole thing, which is when pilots need to leave the cockpit, to go to the bathroom or anything else, the door has to open. What do you do about that? And if you fly a lot, and especially if you're toward the front of the plane, you've seen flight attendants just kind of block the space right outside the cockpit with usually a beverage cart. They just kind of physically block it, and they stand there, and the pilot can come out and go into the bathroom, do whatever else they have to do. And that's really all there was until now. Take a look at this. This is Southwest Airlines showing us the secondary cockpit barrier. So this is outside the cockpit, and there you see the flight attendant has pulled this other door closed. So now basically what she would be able to do on this flight, or any flight attendant for Southwest as these roll out would be able to do, is pull that closed, and then that whole galley area in front there, including the restroom, is secure. So the pilots can step out, do whatever they need to do, and go back in without the flight attendant having to just sort of guard the door manually with a beverage cart. Southwest just put the first of its aircraft with this in service. They tell me that there are a couple more coming this year. Southwest has like 700 airplanes. So this is going to take some time, but one by one, they're taking them out of service as they go out for their usual maintenance and putting in these doors. So Southwest, the first airline that has taken this option offered by Boeing to sort of further secure these 737s that it flies, and we'll see how many more other airlines begin to do this in the future. And again, they're as far as they're concerned, keeping things safe, but just doing it kind of in a more difficult way right now. This door finally streamlines that process of keeping people away from the open cockpit door when in fact it is open. Travel and tourism. This has been an interesting year here with the tariffs and everything else going on in the country, and we've heard in the United States of some declines in tourism to some parts of the country from certain source markets. That's what you call places where people come from. There is one destination market in America that is being hit particularly hard. That is Las Vegas. I'll show you these images from our friends at KLAS, Channel 8 over there. Our next star sister station in Las Vegas. You see people there, but if you were to look at similar video from a year ago, you would see more people. That, at least according to statistics that we've seen coming out there. And why are we talking about Las Vegas? Well, Las Vegas is a giant tourism destination, and more so than almost any other destination, tourism is really just what Las Vegas does. That is not only its number one industry, but it's overwhelmingly dominant industry there. And why is that? And that's sort of, I should say, why the declines. And that's something that's harder to say. What we know is that, for example, you take a look at June tourism, down like 11% compared to a year earlier. That's a big chunk for a large market. We're talking about a lot of people. It takes in terms of raw numbers, a lot of far fewer people coming to drive tourism down by 11% there. The convention and visitor business as well. Conventions, conferences going to Vegas, that part down as well. So what's going on? Well, analysts say probably some combination of what I mentioned before, those tariffs and other issues in the United States, just the fact that the country, as far as some people are concerned from around the world, not as welcoming now. Visa hassles, those sorts of things getting through, and people saying, even if I'm not going to have the hassle, maybe I don't necessarily want to support the United States in terms of giving it my tourism dollars. We're hearing some of that from markets like Canada and Mexico. But beyond that, something that has nothing to do with any of that new stuff, Las Vegas used to be a very affordable destination. So it was this mass marketplace where, yeah, if you had extra money, you could spend it and you could stay in an extra fancy hotel and they would gladly help you part ways with your money. But on the other hand, parking was free, the big buffets with lots of food. And so people of all different incomes could enjoy Las Vegas. The complaint has been in recent years that has gone away. Parking's expensive now. Food is expensive now. Hotel rooms are expensive now. And for years, people complained, but people kind of kept going anyway. And so this might be the moment, it seems, where people are not only complaining, but they are actually perhaps staying away because of some combination of all those factors. So that's something we're going to continue to watch. Again, because Las Vegas, although just one of many, many destinations, is such a key destination in the United States for domestic travelers, as well as those from around the world. When we come back, much, much, much more on what we started the show with, Spirit Airlines. Welcome back to Insider Itinerary. I am, once again, Seth Kaplan. We talked earlier about that second Spirit Airlines bankruptcy filing. I want to talk more about that because this is a big deal. How big a deal? Well, I have a lot of other questions. First, let me introduce the person who's going to be helping to answer these questions for this part of the show, Jay Shabbat of Airline Weekly. Jay and I we've been friends for decades and worked together for many years covering the airline industry at Airline Weekly, most notably. And Jay, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us here today. So yeah, Spirit Airlines. I'll start off with this. I read Brett Snyder of Cranky Flyer wrote, the only thing to him surprising about this bankruptcy filing was that it was a Chapter 11 filing and not a Chapter 7 filing. In other words, that Spirit Airlines intends to reorganize rather than just liquidating. A lot of airlines historically have filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, reorganization, and done so successfully. The list of those that have filed a second time and reorganized successfully is shorter. But anyway, your quick take so far, and then we can get into the weeds a little bit more on Spirit Airlines again filing for bankruptcy for the second time in less than a year.
Yeah, Seth, and thanks for having me. Just like old times, chatting airlines again. Seth, my old colleague. Yeah, so Spirit Airlines. I just to recap what you said, they did on Friday file for a second bankruptcy. That's the second one within less than a year, which is very unusual. Just as a way of background, their first bankruptcy filing was a little bit of a special case. Let's call it a unique kind of bankruptcy filing, where they really intended just to address their financial cost. So basically, they had some outstanding debt that they owed to bondholders, perhaps some banks, and that bankruptcy was focused on just addressing that particular debt. It did
And when
not.
you say financial cost, just to draw off sort of a fine line there, you're talking not, for example, labor costs. In past decades, airlines have tried to get out of what they thought were expensive pilot contracts or flight attendants or other work groups, and so forth. That's not what Spirit Airlines was trying to do here, because if it tried to pay its pilots any less, it wouldn't have any pilots, because it's a competitive industry. Is that kind of the distinction you're making here? Or is that a very, very narrow kind of cost?
That's exactly the distinction I was trying to make. So to run the airline, labor costs, your airport costs, your aircraft costs, they didn't really touch any of that during their first bankruptcy. This time around, they presumably are going to try to address those quote unquote operating costs rather than just the quote unquote financial cost. So can they do that? Well, they're going to try. The obviously it's they're going to have to. There are special bankruptcy laws that make it somewhat easier to, for example, break a contract that you have with a labor union or with an aircraft lessor. So the US bankruptcy laws kind of help make that a little bit easier than it otherwise would be. However, they ultimately have to, have willing people on the other end of those contracts. So if they say to the unions, let's say they say to the pilot union, we want you to, I'm just making this number up, but we want you to, accept a 20% lower pay. Ultimately, the union's going to have to decide whether or not, a union and its members, of course, are going to have to decide whether or not that's acceptable. Now, a lot of that decision will be based on the market at the time for labor costs. Now, about 2, 3 years ago, the US airline labor market was very tight. Pilots could, if Spirit didn't want to pay them so much money, well, United was ready to hire them or Southwest was ready to hire them. And it's a little more complicated than that in the airline industry because there's issues of seniority, which we can get into if you want. But for the most part, it was a very tight labor market. It's not quite as tight today. So some of these Spirit workers are and again, if it comes to that, they haven't started this process yet. But if Spirit does decide to go down the route of abrogating labor contracts and trying to renegotiate them, the pilots and the flight attendants and whatever other labor groups they have are going to have to decide, is it worth it for me to accept these lower rates, or should I try to go to another airline or try to go opt for another career? So that's all pending. And then if you think about the contract renegotiation that they might do with an aircraft lessor, for example. So basically, there are companies out there, global companies that rent airlines aircraft. They can try to renegotiate those rents. That is going to be much more difficult because the market for aircraft is very tight right now. The supply is very, very limited. So if Spirit Airlines says to its aircraft lessor, hey, I want you to give me these planes for 20% less, the aircraft lessor might at this stage, given this market, say, why should I do that? I have an airline in South Korea or an airline in Australia or an airline in Brazil that's happy to take it for full price. So that will make this restructuring
And
more
they'll,
difficult.
to make it clear, that they'll repossess the aircraft. I mean, same as a consumer who stops paying on a car lease. You might be able to, and it would be the same dynamic, right? That the company that's leasing me the car as a consumer, uh, if they know that they can repossess the car and just lease it to somebody else easily at the same rate that I was paying, they're going to be more likely to repossess the car than if it's at a very bad moment in time, maybe where everybody's in that situation, and they might say, hey, let's work this out.
Exactly. Yeah. And if Spirit, some there are airlines around the world that went through bankruptcy during COVID when the airline market and the aircraft market was extremely distressed. And some of those airlines that went into bankruptcy at that time, none in the U.S. specifically, but I can name some others, one in South America, one in Europe that I can think of off the top of my head, that was able to lock in very attractive rates because the market at that time was so loose. So this is not a great time to be going into bankruptcy because the global airline and aircraft markets are doing relatively well, more so globally than the US specifically.
Yeah. So, and God, there's so many different ways we could go with this direction. More time than it would take more time than we have. But in terms of where this ends up going, I mean, there are several scenarios. And first, we should say, Spirit is or let's put it this way: if it were to just liquidate, to just break up into parts the way, I don't know, Joanne Fabrics is doing, or Bed Bath and Beyond did, in terms of airlines, it would be the biggest one in a long time. We haven't seen that in a really long. Those of us of a certain age can remember airlines like Eastern and Pan Am going out of business, but we haven't seen an airline as big as Spirit truly liquidate, as opposed to getting acquired, or the brand disappearing in some sort of merger. We know JetBlue wanted to buy Spirit. The government essentially stopped that. We know Frontier several times wanted to buy Spirit, and Spirit stopped that basically. But now a different situation here. Obviously, none of us have a crystal ball, but what if you had to guess? And maybe I'm putting my finger on the scale a little bit here by mentioning Frontier most recently, because I have my own guess. But the way this all ends up, what could you imagine?
I promise I'm going to answer your question, Seth, but if you will give me the liberty, I just want to go back, take a step back, and give everybody who's watching some sense of why Spirit is in so much trouble. So one very big reason is simply that over the course of the past 5 or 6 years, basically since the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, uh, airline revenues have gone up, but airline costs have gone up much more. And if you're an airline like United or Delta, those are two US big carriers that have been rather successful in the post-pandemic era, last couple of years, their revenues have gone up quite a bit as well in tandem with their costs because they fly a lot of premium flights to Europe. And, Americans the last couple of years were going in droves to visit Tokyo and Paris and Brazil. I mean, that's been a big trend. Part of that has to do with the strong dollar. Part of it has to do with, rising stock markets, all that kinds of rising home wealth, all that good job market. So they've been able to get away with this cost inflation much more than an airline like Spirit, which really hasn't seen very much revenue growth at all. A little bit, but not nearly as much as their costs have gone up. I mentioned earlier that the labor market a couple of years ago was very tight, and that meant Spirit had to sign new contracts with their pilots, with their flight attendants, et cetera, that were very inflationary. So Spirit's workforce is making a lot more money today than they were in, say, 2019, 2018, when it was a much healthier company in terms of their profitability. So cost increase is one big reason. There are others as
And to
well.
me, just to interrupt you, so the
Sure.
point is, they're employed, and they're not alone. I mean, Delta's also paying its people more, and United's also paying its people. The difference is that that their customers are also paying them more to fly,
Exactly.
a lot more, people who are flying around the world, and in some cases in premium cabins and that sort of thing. Whereas, if I want to fly business class to Paris, Spirit is not competing for my business. They're stuck with the costs that they have to lay out, but without that, as you said, that revenue, the much higher airfares
Exactly.
that they.
Everybody's costs are up a lot. Only some people's costs, oh, sorry, only some people's revenues are up a lot. And in Spirit's case, they're not. So that's been a real problem. You mentioned also that they had a couple of failed merger opportunities. The JetBlue had a deal to buy them that was ruled illegal from an anti-competitive view by a judge in Massachusetts. Frontiers, as you mentioned, also has has at times made offers to buy them, and that kind of brings us back to your original question. Sorry for the sidewinding here,
Oh,
being roundabout, but Your question is, what ultimately happens here, and one possibility very much is that Frontier could wind up still buying Spirit, or them merging in some fashion. You know, we got to see. Does Frontier would it rather just let Spirit perhaps go away on its own? It's at risk of failing now, and maybe it just doesn't have to deal with the headaches of integrating another airline, paying for its assets and things. Let it just go away, and then they can seize its markets on its own, jump into those markets. Frontier is already playing hardball with Spirit. It's they know that Spirit is badly wounded, so its knives are out. And recently they announced a whole bunch of new routes into Spirit's markets. So this is not a very polite tea party here. The airline industry is tremendously competitive, and so Frontier has the knives out, but they might yet strike a deal. Um, who knows? Maybe JetBlue gets back into the picture. They kind of have their own distress to deal with. Um, there's always private equity, some money on the sidelines, investors looking for, hey, I can maybe make a good buck here by buying a distressed asset, and we'll cut we'll get them to cut the labor rates and the lease rates, and we'll turn it around, make it profitable, we'll make a buck. So there are different avenues that this could go. We don't really know, but one merger is definitely one possibility. Liquidation is another. A third would be, yeah, some private equity comes in and saves them, or some other money, outside money. And then I'll be just to be fair to Spirit here, to give the optimist point of view. It's not entirely out of the realm of possibility that maybe fuel prices fall again. They're already kind of down from where they were. Maybe they fall again. Maybe they do get their contracts renegotiated. And maybe they go into the fall, next spring. Peak season for them is like February, March. Maybe they do start having a legitimate organic turnaround on their own without help. It's not out of the realm of possibility either.
Or maybe I'll give you one more. You and I have been doing this long enough to remember that there's been this very strong revenue environment, as you said here, in recent years, and of course historically it's not always the case. These airlines, these ultra low cost airlines, as they're called, historically have outperformed in bad times, in recessionary environments. We remember 2009, it was completely flipped, where airlines like Spirit were doing phenomenally well because Americans didn't have money to spend a lot, flying around the world in premium cabins. They were just looking for value. And I mean, long story short, everything you described was completely flipped, right? Where it wasn't a revenue environment. You won with low costs. So, we haven't seen one of those environments actually in a long time at this point. And so one question is, if that were to happen again, would that be good for Spirit? But I guess the second question is, will they be around long enough to find out the answer to that question? We will be in a recession sooner or later. I mean, that's just what happens. But Spirit obviously in not so great shape here.
Yeah, recessions can take different forms, and there's certainly the argument to be made that when consumers are pinched, they'll look for the lower cost carrier. There's a few ways I can address. So all of that is true. Now one problem that Spirit is having is that to be the low cost carrier, to offer those low fares and still make money, they have to pursue a business model of growth. They have to keep growing. Now, why is that? It just comes down to the nature of airline economics. When you grow, you gain what economists call economies of scale, efficiencies. A good example of that is, you're flying, you use the same pilot to fly, 8 flights a day rather than 7 flights a day. And you gain those like lower unit costs that way. Spirit has been unable to grow. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why. One of them is simply that the engines on their planes aren't working. They have a couple of planes. That sounds much less like unsafe and unsavory as I make
Right.
engine.
The engine on the plane that you're actually flying on works. The problem is
Works
there are other
fine.
engines
Exactly.
out of service that
Yeah, I probably should rephrase that. But the point is that they have these engines. It's very, new technology engines that they're kind of working out, and there have been some glitches. and so they have to just give them extra inspections. And because so many of these engines exist out there, the inspections are taking a long time. And so they have these grounded airplanes. So that's one reason why they can't grow. Yeah, and then the other reason is simply because when you're in bankruptcy, you have to convince your lenders and whatnot that you're able to make money. So they've been kind of pursuing the opposite of growth. They've been shrinking very rapidly. Now that has the advantage of, okay, I can sell off an airplane to get cash real quick, or I can dump that aircraft lease or get out of that expensive airport gate contract. So there you can see why there's reasons why sometimes distressed airlines have to shrink, but it's not good for growing. At the very same time, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we talk about the cost side, but on the revenue side too, they've kind of gone away from that model of, let's just be as no frills as possible, as cheap as possible, because so many Americans have demonstrated their willingness to pay more for air travel by buying, the more comfortable seat, buying, let's the upgrade, or whatever. Spirit has kind of moved into that realm too. They've added premium amenities, premium products, and things like that. So that kind of makes them not cheap. Now, theoretically, it should raise their revenues, but that's kind of difficult because you're battling against some, carriers that probably have a better reputation for the upper end, the premium end of their product line. We can go on. I just want to make one more point here about a challenge that Spirit faces is that Southwest Airlines too, which is kind of the big gorilla in the domestic market. They are the largest airline domestically in the United States. I believe that's true. It depends on how you measure. American might be a little bigger, but they're just giant, and they overlap Southwest on a lot of routes. They are now offering what's called a basic economy ticket, which is kind of their version of the Spirit fare. Very basic. You can, you pay low, but you pay a low price, but there's all sorts of restrictions attached. They never did that before. So suddenly, in all of these Spirit markets, they have these new Spirit-like fares that Southwest is offering. So that's just one more one more reason to explain why Spirit finds itself in this just really difficult situation.
Yeah, and anybody, even as a consumer, if they didn't understand the dynamics behind the scene, why in our market here, filming this in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, especially parts of our market, York, PA, for example, Baltimore, right there. Just think about for our viewers over the years, very often Southwest. If I was trying to fly to lots of different places, let's say Fort Lauderdale, Southwest was there, Spirit was there. Southwest would have had a much higher fare bundled, the bags and all that free, but Spirit that really enticing low fare, and now that differential might
And
not be the
Southwest
same
is
anymore.
now selling their tickets through all the online distribution platforms. And I could say to everybody that Seth has long uh, called for them to do that, and finally they're listening. So
Yeah, it's true. You go into Expedia. There are people in the past where if they didn't think to go straight to Southwest, they wouldn't have maybe seen Southwest's inventory, as airlines call it, the seats and fares available there. But now it's right there alongside Spirit and everybody else.
so Spirit does find itself in a tough position. They're going to have to, you know, I think if anything, they're going to either have to find a merger partner or get their costs down to where they're just so much lower than everybody else. Whether they're going to be able to do that through unfortunate labor cuts or by other means. The fact of the matter is that labor is that's probably about a third of your cost. So there's not too many other avenues where you can look for savings. Fuel is that's you're just you take what the market gives you. There's nothing really you can do with fuel. So and they've been lucky. It is very strange that here we are in this market where fuel has been relatively inexpensive, particularly relative to the last couple of years. But yet we have all these low cost carriers at a distress, which is it used to be when fuel was very cheap, it was a party time for the whole industry. And that's not really been the case in the US anyway. I think globally, airlines are enjoying that low fuel prices a little bit more. But yeah, just a unique situation.
Yeah. Jay Shabbat, we've gone longer with this segment usually than we do here on Insider Itinerary, but I wanted to leave time for that just because it's always fascinating. More we could talk about, we'll do it some other time. But for now, thank you. And thank you for being with us. We'll be back in a minute to wrap up this edition of Insider Itinerary. If you fly a lot, there's a good chance you're a member of an airline loyalty program, frequent flyer programs, as they were originally known. And you probably know how these work, right? You get it's like any other loyalty program. Shop at the supermarket, what have you. You get points as you shop, and you can redeem them, but maybe you don't have forever to redeem them. And just kind of keeping with the theme, we've been talking about Spirit Airlines here. I want to show you an email I got from Spirit Airlines just the other day. Here's how to stop your points from expiring. You see there, I have a small number of points that I got, for a flight, probably, whatever the limit is that they expire after 18 months or 3 years or whatever it is there. I can't remember now, that they were going to expire. So what can you do about it? And they're basically trying to encourage me to have some kind of activity, right? To spend some money doing something so that the points stay active, that kind of thing. Well, and I'll admit, I thought to myself, well, one way to keep your points from expiring is not to fly an airline that might not still be in business soon, right? I mean, that's Spirit is in that situation where there is that possibility that this could be how this ends, although we've seen more often than not airlines in Spirit's case end up, even if they don't survive as their own brand, maybe as part of another airline, and then the points go over to that airline. I want to tell you, I remembered one time in my life where that went back a pretty long way. I'll put it this way. My United Airlines frequent flyer account used to be a Continental Airlines frequent flyer account. Continental and United merged about 15 years ago at this point. But then those Continental miles actually originated way back in the 1980s as Eastern Airlines miles. Eastern Airlines liquidated in 1991, but years later, I found these old paper frequent flyer mile statements in a drawer in the family kitchen back in Florida for myself and both of my parents. And I called Continental Airlines because I knew that they had essentially absorbed Eastern. And I said, hey, I've got these old things. Anyway, you could honor this and give us the miles. And they said, actually, yeah. They said, send us a copy and we'll give you the miles from back then. So it just goes to show you that these miles can stick around for a really long time beyond the airline itself. Let's hope the Spirit, one way or another, manages to get through the time it's going through, and one way or another, customers, employees, and everybody will be able to keep working at the airline, enjoying the flights, and so forth. That's all the time we have for this edition of Insider Itinerary. We will be back, as always, next week with lots more exciting content. Until then, I'm Seth Kaplan. Travel safely.
Hi, I'm Eric Finkenbinder from ABC 27. We're excited to announce the new ABC 27 News Plus app. Live stream newscasts or watch content on demand. This is different than the ABC 27 app on your smartphone. You can check this out at home, and it's very easy to use. With a Fire Stick, go to the home page, scroll down to search. From there, enter ABC 27. Move over to the apps, and there we are. Click the icon and install. It's just that easy.